Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here. Thanks, Samira. Thanks, CDC, for organizing this. It is a bit unnerving to talk like this. I'm not quite used to not knowing who's listening, who's there. Uh, but nevertheless, let's try and see um, how one can go about this. Um, just to give a brief introduction about myself and what I'm trying to talk about through this talk is I am, as many of you might know, and some of you might not, I have in my career really worn two hats. One as a film editor, uh, come an occasional filmmaker, and film programmer. I've been the artistic director of the Kerala Film Festival for very long. Um, Basically, I have found that these two jobs or these two hats that I wear inform each other very beautifully. And in fact, the strengths of both have played out in my career, and I think they both really helped me. As a film editor, I've, of course, worked with numerous people. Unfortunately, I'm stuck in the UK. I don't have my own hard disk over here. So I am not going to be able to show much of my own work. Some of you might know it, but I will basically, as a film programmer also, I have seen a lot of films. My job is just watching films, and I like to sort of think about what it is that makes me choose one film above the other. And my sort of brain as a film editor also works in that capacity. So I'm going to show clips. There's just one clip from my work. The rest is films that, for me, raise issues that I would like to talk about. So basically, I call this finding the story. Now, this story that I am talking about is not only as a filmmaker, how we find this story, but also as audiences, which really interest me because as a film programmer, that's very important. How do audiences find the story, and what are the tools that we use to help them find a story? Um, so, as we all know today, unreliability is the axiom of our digital age. Truth is sort of morphed in various ways. Uh, People Photoshop themselves. Movies can fake almost anything through computer graphics, etc. My question is there still a line to be drawn between the truth and fiction, or have these lines been blurred irretrievably? Um, Also, as filmmakers, is it our business to heighten these differences or to blur these lines further? And as I said earlier, as viewers, what are the tools that we offer? Many years ago, actually, when I was just starting my programming time, there was this film called Lessons of Darkness by Herzog, which starts with a quote by Blaise Pascal. The film is about the Gulf War. And I remember reading that and saying, wow, he's found it. I mean, he's found such a perfect quote to set the mood for the film. Later, I read that actually this was not a quote, but the filmmaker himself had written it. Now, that's really interesting because for me, that truth, which I had thought was coming from somebody, actually is the filmmaker. And subsequently, I read what Herzog had to say about it, and I'd just like to uh, read a bit of what he said, because for me, this is really something that has always been a kind of axiom in my mind. Uh, I'm quoting Herzog. With this quotation as a prefix, I elevate the spectator. Before he has even seen the first frame to a high level from which to enter the film. And I, the author of the film, do not let him undescend from the height until it is over. Only in this state of sublimity does something deeper become possible, a kind of truth that is the enemy of the mere factual. Ecstatic truth, I call it. Knowing a mix of truth and lies that gets at the emotional core of a chosen subject more accurately than the hated accountant's truth of statistics and inflexibly hard facts could ever. Now, this for me was actually quite a important uh, sort of moment in my viewing experience, etc. Because for me, suddenly, uh, the fact that you want to or you purposely do this kind of uh, you know manipulation to get at a greater truth, the truth beyond the what he calls the hard facts. So, I mean, for me, I think this is something that makes a film interesting. These are the layers. It's not about some notion of the truth, but a story that you tell to get at a truth. I'd like to, at this point, just talk about my own experience. I had worked with John Abraham. Many of you uh, probably know of him. The film was called Amarian. It is a cult film in Kerala. It's the story of, in a sense, it's the story of the Naxal movement. It's a story of the disappointments in the Naxal movement, etc. But it was also a documentation of uh, uh, certain things that happened in Kerala at that point. I'll just show you a clip, and then I will talk about what happened at the editing time of this. I'm just going to show you this clip. It's from the film called Amarian. It's very famous. I think lots of people may have seen it, but I'd like to just talk a little about it. Let me make this full screen. Sorry, why is it not playing? Sorry, something's happened to my computer. Christ. Just a minute. Let me just see. Very sorry. Okay. Just a minute. Sorry, he says to open with this. ഞാൻ അമ്മയെ അറിയിക്കട്ടെ ഞാൻ അമ്മയെ അറിയിക്കട്ടെ Uh, so, as you saw, this is a sequence where the camera goes over two long lines. This is very early in my career, and I have to tell you all that I saw this rush, and like any eager young editor, I sort of cut it up. Actually, I cut it up and had removed. I thought it's repetitive, and I mean, once you show them, that's enough, etc. And John came into the editing room and he said, "What are you doing? Just leave them. Just leave the three shots as they are. Just don't do anything." Uh, I was rather, I mean, I must say at that point, one really didn't know. But now when I look back or I this sort of reflect on those conversations where we had, I realized that what John did was to convert fiction into documentary, because we know that that whole scene was completely set up. It wasn't as if these people were there in line or there was any. It was all completely set up. But the memory now, in fact, it's really strange, because the memory of that moment, of that movement, which was that the Naxal that area took the ration shop owners' ration and distributed it among the people free. That movement is remembered by this uh, through uh, this imagery. So, in fact, what happens is fiction becomes documentary. So, this kind of level of filmmaking, which creates these various levels of uh, you know documentary. And I'm not talking about just the mixing of documentary and fiction, because it's not about mixing. It's about how you use the tools of filmmaking that you have to make this transition. And therefore you get, so it is through the process of editing. If I had cut those shots, it would not have seemed as it does seem now, where you're actually following and staying and showing again and again this situation. I know that today many films do this. Many films are sort of uh, making this transition, but uh, it's not enough to just have documentary elements. This is my point. It's not about having documentary elements. It's about this going sort of into a different layer. Uh, uh, Over here, I'd like to talk about, of course, I saw Nasir recently, where I thought he did this very well, that he was able to, the filmmaker, talked about the situation of Nasir. So there is a character, and the character is in a milieu, and the background does not remain a background, but it becomes a story. That was the important thing, that when you hear the sounds through the soundscapes, etc., you actually locate him. So it's not only location. This is, I think, in Nasir, what was important is through the cinematography, through the editing, through the direction, he creates a different world in which he locates his character. So that becomes a story as well. Another film that does this very interestingly, which I have seen recently, is Anamika Haxa's film, which I don't know again if you all have seen, called Ghode Ko Jalebi Khilane Le Ja Raha Hoon. The film has done extremely well. It's been shown all over the place. It is, in the beginning of the film, she says that this has been culled out of the dreams of many migrant laborers in Old Delhi. But it is a fiction film. It is a film that is a fiction film with characters, etc. But these transitions she makes from fiction to documentary using cinematic means. I'll just show you a clip that I have, which would be able to Okay, here we go.
अरे बड़ा आलसी बाभन कहीं का, यहाँ न चलतो तोर गाँव में, यहाँ न चलतो। अच्छा हमारे सबके जितना फैमिली साथी है, कभी नहीं पूछल क्या आदमी, कभी This, I mean, this transition that she makes from a fictional sequence to a documentary, which not well, it's not documentary, but to actually it's this touching of people. And I think more than anything, it's how it is edited, how you get closer and closer and closer, and suddenly it's abstract, and it is this abstraction that brings uh, this this extra layer of what this film is trying to say. Of course, it is the soundscape. You have the sound of the train going, you have the heaving, you have the lullaby that comes. uh, so these are this is what elevates this film to not being important, whether it's a documentary, whether it's fiction. It's the telling of a story. That is what I think. So as editors, what do we look for? Basically, we look for clarity. We look for what is it we are trying to say, what is it we are trying to get at. And in this film, very clearly, you can see what she's getting at. She's getting at some at the actually the fiber of labor, which is which is, I haven't seen this happen in many films like this. The other thing is, I think, flatness. We try and avoid flatness. We don't want a scene to just go in one keel. Here you can see how slowly, Paresh Kamdar is the editor of the film. How wonderfully he has got you into the story of the laborers. So it's not dreams. It's not it's not just sound. It's actual physicality of the labor. The other thing I really look for in editing, and I think is one of the most important things that you uh, ought to get, is elegance. The elegance of flow. Um, how do we go from one thing to the other? How do we not make it look, without emotion? How do you evoke emotion in a scene? I think for me, these are the three sort of standards I set for myself while editing a film. That you look for clarity in thought, what it is you're getting at, what is it that you are, what are your elements of this thing, why don't, how do you tell a story that people stay engaged, uh, and how is it elegantly told with kind of flow in what you're trying to say. Uh, I'm going to talk slightly disconnected, but I think all of this is going to lead up to what I'm trying to say about the fascination of this blurring between uh, the line that is real and unreal, or true and untrue, or fictional and documentary. So I think as filmmakers, we have numerous tools that we use to sort of evoke what we call documentary or fiction. I'd like to show a film, again, another small clip from another film. It's called uh, I'm Not Your Negro. I also thought it is rather a good time to show this film, show this clip. It is a film by Raoul Peck. He is a Haitian filmmaker. He made this film on Baldwin. It is available, I believe, on Netflix. But when I saw this, I was I was very struck by so many things he has done to tell a much greater story than just a kind of biopic of a writer, James Baldwin. So I'm just going to play a small clip that will, just a minute, I'll have to open this. Uh, Should I start this again? Sorry, I'm just starting it.
Mr. Baldwin, I'm sure you still meet the remark that what are the Negroes? Why aren't they optimistic? They say, but it's getting so much better. There are Negro mayors. There's Negroes in all of sports. There are Negroes in politics. They're even accorded the ultimate accolade of being in television commercials now. I'm glad you're smiling. Is it at once getting much better and still hopeless?
Well, I don't think there's much hope for it, to tell you the truth. As long as people are using this peculiar language. It's not a question of what happens to the Negro here, to the black man here. That's a very vivid question for me, But the real question is what's going to happen to this country. I have to repeat that.
Your time right, I got the blues. From my head down to my shoes. Your time right, I got the blues. From my head down to my shoes. I can't win, 'cause I don't have a thing to lose. I stopped by my daughter's house. I just want to use the phone. I stopped by my daughter's house. I just want to use the phone.
To J. Acton, Spartan Literary Agency, June 30th, 1979. My dear Jay, I'll confess to you that I am writing the enclosed proposal in a somewhat divided frame of mind. The summer has scarcely begun, and I feel already that it's almost over. and I will be 55. Yes, 55 in a month. I am about to undertake the journey. And this is a journey, to tell you the truth, which I always knew that I would have to make, but had hoped, perhaps, certainly hadn't hoped not to have to make so soon. I am saying that a journey is...
Yeah. So this film, I must say, has, of course, enormous relevance today. It was made a few years ago, but Raoul Peck took 10 years to make this film, actually. He was quite... I mean, it was such a challenge to him, I think, because mainly what one does see is that he wants to sort of historically place it today. And I'm just totally fascinated by all the techniques that he's used and, created what is actually a piece of work that we would describe as a documentary. What are the things he has used? He's used titles. He has used titling, the typewriter, the black and white, titles, all through the film. Various forms of titling are used to convey thoughts and ideas. He's used historical footage. He's used, the interviews of James Baldwin, but he's also used photographs from today with the music, how he has sort of pulled the whole film into today and made that actually the story of the film also. He has used, most interestingly, he has used the voice of Samuel Jackson. Now, Samuel Jackson speaks in the first person. You think you are to believe that Samuel Jackson is actually James Baldwin. You hear James Baldwin's voice. It's not as if you don't know that James Baldwin is there and you know his voice. But Samuel Jackson, as a voiceover, is, is a separate person, but he takes on the persona of James Baldwin. So what does this film do to you? This film, I think, becomes not about activism or about, but it becomes about ideas, about thoughts, about what James Baldwin was engaging with. And he has therefore arrived through, in fact, a lot of fictional elements. This is what I'm trying to say, that these are all actually fictional elements that he uses to arrive at what is the story of James Baldwin. So it's not about only interviews. It's not only about finding some so-called truth. It is what the filmmaker today is experiencing as he gets into the mind of James Baldwin. So I mean, this film for me, very, very beautifully actually blurs these lines, which we were talking about, but blurs them in a way that you get closer to a truth and not get removed from what we think is something that the filmmaker is trying to say. So this is one kind of filmmaking. This is one way that you approach something that you're very close to, or you're trying to tell a story. Of course, you can do it in a number of ways, but I thought here was a kind of storytelling solution that was found that actually gets to the heart of what the story is. And of course, today we have, I think, unlike a lot of my generation who worked, who did not have access to archives and so much footage, today there is so much access to archive footage. How do you convert all this into this story? not into how, and it's basically, actually it comes down to the editing of it in a coherent way. There is another film that I would like to talk about, which again deals with this notion of truth and fiction, but in a totally different way. This is a film called Of Fathers and Sons. It was made by a Syrian filmmaker called Terek Dalal. Terek is a Syrian filmmaker who is lives in Germany, and he decided he wanted to go back to Syria and sort of film his own place, etc., and get at the truth of what is happening over there. Now, what he does is very interesting, and I must tell you, this film was a super hit. In the sort of documentary film festival circuit, this film was highly, highly sort of noticed and talked about. But for me, it was interesting that the conversation was about his braveness, etc. What the filmmaker did was he masqueraded as, or he pretended to be a sympathizer, and he goes and he lives with a family in Syria, which is a very strong fundamentalist family. And he, in a sense, unravels the whole dynamic, etc. But for me, all the time we feel as if we are watching this family in a strange way, because right in the beginning of the film, the filmmaker tells us that, look, I am doing this. At the end of the film, he says, look, I can never go back to my country. I have to go and live in Germany, etc. So what happens is he sort of sandwiches this film between these two truths, and the whole film seems to play out in an not in a very truth. At least in a space of, let's say, untruth. But you get very involved with the characters. The boy that you will see, he finally has to join the Taliban because the father wants him to. His name is Osama. So I just want to show you a clip of this film, and you'll see how endearing it is, and why sometimes this kind of thing can be problematic, but also interesting as a way of telling a story. I will just play it.
شو اسماء الشباب؟ هذا ابراهيم، هذا محمد، هذا سعد، هذا محمد، هذا عبد الله، هذا قطي، هذا محمد عمر، هذا اسحاق، هذاك اسامه. هذا الرجل اليوم مضرب ابراج امريكا. قمت دعيت الى الله سبحانه وتعالى، يا رب اسالك باسمك العظيم ان ترزقني طفل بعلم الاسلام. قال جاء لي محمد عمر 11/9/2007. 2007 اي والله، بعد 6 سنوات من الضرب. بعد 6 سنوات اي والله، يعني يا رب العالمين استجاب الدعوه بعد 6 سنوات من الضرب. فسميته محمد عمر. نفس التاريخ، نفس التاريخ والله. 11 ابدا. ولاده طبيعيه والله ما تاخر عن هذاك التاريخ يعني سبحان الله. يعني ليش سميته محمد عمر؟ المناسبه ما بتنتهي. مين اللي نفذ محمد عطا، بس محمد عمر امير المؤمنين بافغانستان. فمن كثر ما يعني بحب الطالبان فعلا سبحان الله سميته محمد عمر. سميت اسامه محمد عمر. أسامة تقريبا عمره 12 سنة 11 سنة. ما يجيب. ليش سميته أسامة؟ أسامة لأنه بحب الشيخ أسامة. الشيخ أسامة. وسميت أيمن كمان لأني بحب الدكتور أيمن كثير. أيمن صوان. أي والله. فكنت دائما سبحان الله تابع أخبار ساعة الجهاد بأفغانستان من خلال الإعلام. أتحمس لما أسمع، انبسط كثير إنه قد كان عمرك؟ أيوه أنا مواليد 74. فكنت دائما يعني لما اخبر انه الروس مثلا ضربوا الطالبان شجع هيك يتحمس كلمة الإسلام هي يتحمس بالفعل. سألني أحد الأخوة بالسجن إنه مسمي أسامة وأيمن محمد عمر وخطاب وغيره. إذا أنا مش عم بحب هاي الشخصيات. قلت له والله يا أخي الكريم لو كان تعلم الحب اللي في داخلي لهالأشخاص هؤلاء يعني لو الحب اللي في داخلي يعني ألقوه على كوكب الأرض ما سمي كوكب الأرض سمي كوكب الحب.
I forgot to say right in the beginning that if you all have any questions, please sort of put them in, because as we go to the end, the last 15-20 minutes of this talk, I can answer any questions that you all might have. Right, so this film was, as I said, very, very popular and very well received all over the world. But for me, it was disturbing. I felt that, when I'm investing myself in this character who I thought was a very, he humanized him, but it was always with the understanding that actually we were watching him in a peculiar way. So um, I wanted to show this clip because I thought, and in the end of the film, that little boy Osama is taken away to join the Taliban, and it's a very disturbing kind of confusion that happens in one's mind about sort of pegging yourself on that character, not pegging yourself on a character. Um, so so while you can use digital means to sort of manipulate images, you can do all that, but also there are aesthetic and choices that you make that mess with the audiences in a way, that create this confusion, create this thing, which lead to greater understanding and thought about what the film is. Actually, for me, I would rather look at cinema much more in a way than that, Abbas Kiarostami, the Iranian filmmaker, always said. He said, you should be able to go with a film, travel with a film in such a way that you're not always expecting something exciting to happen, something, it's almost like the joy of watching cinema is when one does not feel dictated to all the time, that you can go and watch and see and find your own uh, ways to peg. I think that is for me, because it's like reading poetry or listening to music or something, or looking at a painting where you say that you find your own stories. There are always sub stories over there, and it is these stories that actually foreground the other stories that are there. So when you read a piece of poetry, I think that's why it's important that all of us do not sort of cubby or hole ourselves. I think a lot of youngsters today think just watching cinema is education on cinema. But I would say education on cinema is much more reading poetry, listening to music, and through one's mind actively engage in finding what are the stories that are happening over there. I'll show one final clip again from Abbas Kiarostami's film, where you will see what I mean about. This is from The Taste of Cherries, where the main character is driving around, and we will see how he tells so many other stories through that one, in that one drive. 1 minute. Sorry. Yeah. So for me, that sequence is quite wonderful. Actually, the whole film is, in a sense, in that way. So I think what I've tried to say through this is that all cinema is fictional, and it is for us as filmmakers to mould mold what the story that we want to tell, which becomes the story of the human condition. Actually, that's what we try to get at. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Okay, so there is what about the ethics of somebody has asked, what about the ethics of embedding yourself in a pro-Taliban family with the intention of revealing the Taliban stronghold on its supporters' minds and hearts? What about the ethics of embedding? Yeah. Well, this is what this is what I found interesting about the film, that he has used this technique of, in fact, subterfuge in a way. I mean, one cannot take an ethical stand, actually. This is quite interesting because even in our own editing experiences, for example, when you edit interviews, when you edit sequences, the way you put them together, the way, I mean, it is manipulation. There is a lot of manipulation that happens. I remember I was editing a film where just the removal of one word changes the meaning of the whole sentence. Now, would one do it? Would one not do it? Does it serve the purpose of telling a story? Does it serve the purpose of telling the story that you want to tell? I think these are decisions we have to make as we go along as filmmakers. So um, I won't make an ethical judgment about it, but I must say that as a viewer, it was disturbing for me. I was not able to, in fact, sort of frame the film the way perhaps the filmmaker wanted to. So there is a question from somebody called an Eternal Wanderer, who asks, are there any top 10 documentaries which we can watch to adapt these tools in our fiction work, please? Well, that's really difficult to say, but there are so many good documentaries. I have recently been very interested in how archival footage is used. There is a very young filmmaker in the US who's now working. In fact, I have a clip of his work. His name is Khalik Allah. and he made a film called Black Mother, which was a journey back to Jamaica. And it's quite a fascinating film. He has used non-synchronous sound. He has used images. He's shot over so many years. So he's got 16 footage. He's got, so all these add the layers. Well, I think I can't just off the top of my head say any 10 documentaries, but perhaps we can talk. And okay, there are so many questions about the clip from Amma Aryan in the conversation using without cutting. Could you talk about how real time and filmic time interact to create a feeling of truth? Now, this is really an interesting question. So, Ravi, thanks. Yeah. You know, the essence of cinema for me is time. When these three shots are put together in a continuous sense of time, I think there is a gravity that comes, which would not have come if the audience was able to or was seeing interventions in terms of, you know, cuts, good cuts. In fact, I thought I'd made a fantastic cut of that sequence. You know, I had sort of built it up, and there were faces in between and so on and so forth. But I think the immediacy of not cutting, that created the truth. So I don't know if it's about real time and filmic time, but rather more about the real feeling and the filmic feeling that you do create. And therefore, that translates into real time and perhaps filmic time. I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's difficult to articulate, because when you get a rush, how do you this was actually the great learning from that how do you look at it, how do you look at rushes without actually wanting to be an editor? You have to look at rushes as wanting to tell a story rather than being an editor. You have to say that, look, these three shots have to tell this story, and it's my business not to you know, create another story, but to put these to tell that story. Sudhir Sudhir Tandon asks, Bina, would you distinguish between fact, factual, and truth? An artist may completely contradict the factual and yet be completely logical in his work and create an emotional truth which has its own integrity. Absolutely. In fact, this is what I'm trying to say. I think, I mean, and that's why when I quoted Herzog in the beginning, I think what we are reaching is an ecstatic truth. It's not a factual truth, but an ecstatic truth. And I think the emotional, whether this emotionally appeals to everybody is not really something we can predict, but certainly the attempt is. And I think when you saw that clip of I Am Not Your Negro, that arrival at the emotional truth of what Baldwin was trying to say, and to say it is not history, it is today actually. I think that is the integrity one looks for, and not only to say this is the fact and this is. Therefore, when you use the voice of somebody else to be Baldwin, you are not being factually true, but you have used something to get into another truth. Then Devyansh, okay, there are lots of questions. Is it always important? Anmol Bains ask, Is it always important for a documentary to provide a solution or a perspective on a topic? Can't it just focus on pure documentation of events or conversations over a period of time? My contention is there is no such thing as pure documentation. It is not about solutions but the moment you put the camera, the moment, I mean, this is like basic stuff. The moment you place the camera, the moment you choose to remove certain things, you are giving a perspective on a subject. There is no way that you can say that I am going to, I mean, there are fly on the wall documentaries where people look, watch, observe, but that is observation. That's again, it was, so I don't think there is any thing called pure documentation. Fawzia Khan asks, when you say story, you compare documentary with fiction. Do we really need to compare the documentary with it? Does not documentary itself have its own story? Exactly, that's what I'm trying to say, that documentary films, always you believe that documentary films don't have a story, but actually documentary films are just as much about storytelling. I can tell you that as editors, we need to work with documentary footage exactly the same way as we work with fictional footage in terms of um, creating situations, creating scenes, building characters, emotional attachments. As Surabhi says, we have to look at time, we have to. So all the elements of editing fiction. So there's no, what I'm saying is this is an artificial line actually. This art, it's a blurred line. There is no such thing as pure fiction and pure documentary. Everything, it's together. So that story is, it's actually the story that matters. Ramani asks a question from Amarian. When you edited first with the same music cues, or you edited without anticipating the music? I have to tell you, Ramani, as you know, those days we were editing on moviolas and so on. So other than playing music in the background, which was done, we didn't have a track. I mean, it wasn't so easy as it is now to lay a track on the Avid and have it playing and so on. But certainly I mean, John and I, John in his own way, John used to whistle a lot. So as you're editing, John will be whistling in the background. And I think those rhythms and those thoughts, so whether it's not specific music, but certainly there was music playing in the background, and that gave us the gave us sort of anticipated what it would be. Yeah, but I didn't have a music track playing at all. Documentaries, Sharik Haider Naqvi asks, documentaries are considered to be about real life, truthful, factual, but manipulations are involved on every steps of filmmaking. Perception and ideology of the filmmaker is an important factor. I wish to know if any previous studies have been done on this field. A lot of studies have been done on this field. I think I have sort of made these comments through my experiences of watching and seeing films, etc. But I think a lot of studies have been done. I think, I can't quote, I'm not a theoretician at all. But I do know that even in feminist studies, in all kinds of ways, this business of the blurring of the lines between documentary and fiction have been studied, I think you can find that very important. You can find that quite easily. Anudha Kunath has asked, how important is sound in editing? On location sound, or can sound help create impressions? And then she says, most times it's difficult to get good quality sound. How do we usually deal with this? I think sound is an element that we manipulate as much as the image. Manipulate is not a nice word, I must say, but that we use to make impressions and tell stories. And location sound is only one of those things. So even if you don't get a good location sound, you can do endless things with sound. And I think this is, I quoted from the film Nasir. I just showed you all Jalebi. These are films where the soundscape actually together with the images creates this abstraction or creates this extra. So you don't have to worry too much about location sound. You have to actually just let your imagination go and know that you can do anything. Yeah. Somebody called Thompson George says, okay, can you please explain the rhythm of editing through your words and experiences? It's difficult to explain because what is rhythm? I mean, if you look at lots of, you listen to music, it's difficult to define. And with cinema, I feel that most of the time, or a lot of the time, the rhythm is dictated by the material you get. You watch a rush and you know, in a sense, what sort of how it needs to be edited. So I think that's um, it's it's a very difficult thing to really explain. But I must say that it's like music, that you know, when you see films, and it's also to do with ideas. So sometimes you purposely shift or take hold of a rhythm and change it to tell another way of telling a story. But basically, the rhythm is dictated by the ideas, by the shots, by what you're trying to say. And often, when the rhythm of a film is wrong, you would see, the interesting thing about editing, I would say, is that it's it's the less visible the editing is, the better an editor you are, which is a very interesting thing, because we are always trying to erase ourselves as editors. There's always this notion that erasure is more important than. So I think that relates to rhythm, because if a film flows properly, you will not see the editing. So it's difficult to explain. You have to keep watching your rushes. You have to look at it again and again and again and find what that rhythm is. Ramani has asked a very interesting question. My concerns during, as a film programmer and festival organizer, I want to know your concerns in this pandemic. Well, my concerns are really very old-fashioned concerns. One is this business now that we are doing of sitting and not seeing audiences, this whole online space that has been created, where I don't see you. There is no actual, I mean, it's wonderful that we can talk to each other, and of course technology has made this possible, but I am really worried about what this is going to do to film viewing, to democratic expressions of protest. and also to how patronage is going to be affected. I mean, I can see that this year, if we do an online festival, our patrons will say next year, yeah, you do an online festival. Why do you need it? It's so easy. It's so much cheaper. Have a discussion. Arvindan Memorial Lecture, which is part of our festival, can be given by somebody sitting in New York or London or Timbuktu or whatever. So these things are worrying me a lot. That how will we go back to a space of normalcy? How will we protest? I mean, I am just so impressed, and it's so scary what is happening in America. But look at how people are just putting their lives on the line. It's it's scary about what might finally be the consequences of this, where everybody decides that they can sort of be in their own bubble. That is what is scary to me. You watch films online, you sit and watch a film festival film at your own time. It's open for one day. So I frankly am really concerned at the moment, and I'm sort of trying to resist that. I mean, the pandemic is really scary. Thousands of people are losing their lives. I know that, and it's a real problem. But whether this online world is the solution is my worry. I don't know if you agree with me, Ramani, but this is a real concern I have. Ma'am, what were the Shobhit Yadav? What were the roadblocks you can face while making or starting documentary fiction? Well, the only roadblock is your mind, I would say. Of course, making any film is a challenge. It's not easy to start any film, but I think in your own mind, you have to know that this is a story you want to tell. It's whether it is a fictional story, it's a purely fictional story, or it's based on something that you've seen, or I think that is the biggest roadblock. There's no other way. I mean, when I'm editing a film, I know that, for example, I was sort of a consultant editor on a film recently, and I tried very hard to explain or to navigate making the film a little more complex, a little more, not just a straight kind of storytelling. And there is resistance because people believe or see that documentary is something to say something, and I personally believe documentary is much more complex, and so any tips for budding editors who have just started to learn this art? Well, the only tip I can give is that you have to watch your material. And I said, I mean, you have to be clear about your ideas. What is it you want to say? I mean, and also to not believe that the machine is what editing is about. I think a lot of people are sort of today believing that if you know a machine, that's what editing is. But I think editing is much more about the mind, looking at material, engaging with stories, understanding how different art forms work, and therefore how it reflects in your work. These are, for me, the important things. Any filmmaking book? Any filmmaking book in your library you want to suggest as to an aspiring documentary filmmaker? The book, I suppose. Well, there are so many books. If you read Sculpting in Time by Tarkovsky, these are not, you see, for me, it's not about documentary filmmaking, or it's about reading and understanding about filmmaking, about telling stories through images. How do you tell a story through image? How do you put them together? How do you create characters? How do you change characters? How do you manipulate time? How do you... So I think that is most important. So I can't tell you any particular book, but there are lots of books. Okay. Here is a question. Could you speak a little more about your unease regarding the film Fathers and Sons? The filmmaker makes his audience get emotionally invested in the protagonist, but right at the start, we know that he himself is critical of the ideology. As an editor, do you think this was manipulative, or do you think this was another way of arriving at the truth of the protagonist? Now, I think it was manipulative, frankly. I think the filmmaker has a power. In a documentary film, the filmmaker, there is an unequal power relationship. And I think when you are not at a level of honesty with your subject, perhaps, there is an element of manipulativeness that arrives at. And I mean, who are you to decide? I mean, or why would you decide to choose this path to get to that truth? Perhaps if he had had an argument with him, I would personally say perhaps the argument, an argument may have been, but this is of course totally. He would never have got there if he had said that I am not with y'all. So this would never have come. But then it becomes confusing. I feel that when you invest in this protagonist and you want, and the filmmaker is telling you that, look, be critical, they're doing the wrong thing. In fact, this little child being sent off to the Taliban is not the right thing. For me, it creates a conflict that is not supportive of what he's trying to say. And as I said, you know, when you edit, there is always this fine line that you have to draw. Can you can you place, for example, an interview in a way that disempowers your subject in a sense, because through editing you have the power to do that, and all the time you have to be conscious, and that kind of sort of investment in the subject is very important. Of course it's manipulative, of course you're trying to say things, but how do you do it without without being harmful, in a sense, I suppose, to the interest of the story you're trying to tell? Yeah, so I was this film was problematic for me, I must say. And it was interesting because this discourse did not happen in the film festival circuit. People were only talking about how wonderfully he had shown, I mean, or exposed, in a sense, this whole area in a human way. It's very humanly done, and you really but there is a discomfort that I was not very pleased with, I must say. Okay, I hope there is something that you all have got out of all this. Thank you all for being here. I'm signing off now.